Oh boy, would you look at those clod hoppers? Welcome back to Nate the Hoof Guy. Well, this right front is definitely the worst of these two, so let's get this picked up and evaluate it. Yeah, those are definitely some skis. There's a roll of wrap for reference. We'll compare that at the end when we're done trimming. Now, when you take a look at a foot like this, you see how much growth is there, and it's a little bit deceiving. It looks like there's hoof everywhere, but at the heel, there's really not that much extra. Where that growth is toward the toe section of this foot. So when it comes to removing hoof, that's where it's going to come from. I'm going to slowly work that down, and I'm going to taper that thinner toward the toe, and that's going to tip that foot back up and put it back into its proper alignment and proper angles. Now, when you look at a foot like this, you got to think to yourself, how can this foot get this big? Why wasn't this trimmed sooner? And you start to think to yourself, it's got to be some type of neglect, right? But there are some things in this foot that we see that will lead us elsewhere. So what am I seeing in this foot? If you notice, look at all the cracking on both of those claws along that white line. That's number one. And two, look at how wide this lateral claw is that I'm working on right now. That is a telltale sign of laminitis. The lamina are what hold the pedal bone in place and attach it to the hard outer surface of this claw. When that inflammation happens, those lamina kind of stretch a little bit and they don't hold that as firm, and that outside wall will start to flare. This is a common manifestation of that. We see it all the time, so it doesn't really jump out to me as anything too crazy. Certainly not a case of neglect. Something just happened inside this particular animal that caused this condition to happen. I also have a lot of background information on this farm, so it's an easy determination for me to make. On this farm, this is my farm with the most aggressive trim schedule, meaning these cows get trimmed the most of any of the farms that I have. Now, this particular one, this is a heifer, so this is her first trip to the chute. But every other cow on this farm gets trimmed almost 4 times a year, about 3.5 times per year on average. Every single animal on the farm gets trimmed. That's great. We prevent a ton of problems doing that. But when you have a heifer in this situation, who typically heifers aren't trimmed at that early of an age, when they have an episode like this, they're going to get that explosion in growth, or what appears to be an explosion in growth due to that. So you're not going to tend to catch them all right when they happen. But when they all come in at the end, that's when we can get that evaluation of the feet, and that's when they get trimmed up. So that's when we're going to see this. You'll notice this is going to trim up pretty nicely, actually. We'll get a little comparison with that roll of wrap, and you can see here how much we've removed. You can see there was a big section of outside wall there that was loose completely. So we just trimmed that away. There's still a lot of support along that dorsal face, so we're good there. Touch this up a little bit, and then we'll give you a little comparison with that roll of wrap. You can see we removed a lot, got a much better angle to that foot now. Now, it's just a matter of getting that foot down and seeing what it looks like. Much better. Now on to the left front. With this one, that flattening and that flaring out is really obvious here. Even when we're done trimming this, you're going to see what that leverage does, that outside wall does to that dorsal face. There's a flare on that claw even after we're done trimming it. Like I said, you'll see that at the end, and it's pretty obvious. Let's get this foot trimmed up, and you'll be able to see how wide this is along this outside wall here as we get that trimmed up. Those yellows and reds you see modeled throughout, that is another sign of laminitis. Right along here is where that white line would be on a normal claw. All of this out here is all extra, the flare from that outside wall, due to, like I said earlier, that the weakening of that connection between those lamina and that outside wall. It causes that flare to happen. Because it's not held as tight, it's able to, just from the weight of the cow, flare out a little bit. And a normal foot, that would be held nice and tight there, so that would be nice and straight up and down. But because it's not held tight, it's allowed to flare. We're going to bring that back into its normal shape somewhat, just because if we were to leave it flat, it's going to continue to flare out, which will exacerbate this problem over time. You can see I was just pointing there. That claw is already down to where I want it to be on that inside part. The extra growth there is actually broken free on its own, shed away naturally, but it did not do that on this lateral claw, so we're going to bring that down. You can see here I'm removing more of that, what would be considered outside wall typically, but because of this flare, it's really not in its natural state. So I'm going to bring it back so that it's got the weight being applied to that outside wall in the correct fashion again, and hopefully we can minimize that flaring that's going to happen. Give you a bit of a survey here now that we've got that hoof all trimmed up. We'll get it down and we'll take a look at that dorsal face and that flare that I was talking about earlier. If you look about halfway up, you can see where there's a little bit of a flare toward the toe of this claw. That's from that weakened laminar support on the inside. It's allowing that face, that dorsal wall, to flare out. That's why we see that widening at the bottom. Now, how about the back feet? What did they look like? Well, the right rear looked like this. And then when it was all trimmed up, it looked like this. The left rear, about the same. Not too much overgrown. This, after it was trimmed.